Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Apocrypha Apocalypse. I'm Gary Machuda, and we're continuing our series looking at medieval, Middle Ages, those type of teachers. What did they believe about the Deuterocanon? Was there a two-stream approach? Was there one stream? How do we view all this data? So we're going father by father, beginning with Gregory the Great, moving to the Council of Trent, and we're investigating who are these early church fathers? What did they believe about the Deuterocanon? And kind of assess their opinion so we can get a handle on what exactly is going on in the Middle Ages just prior to the Reformation. And so far, we've gone over a few early church fathers. We went over Gregory the Great, and we showed that Gregory is a qualified, positive, but qualified positive. We also looked at Isidore Seville, which we ranked as positive. We looked at, whoops, forgot one, Lateran Council 649, positive. We also looked at Eugene II, the Younger of Toledo, positive. We looked at Ildephonsus of Toledo, positive. Council of Toledo, 11 in 675. We saw that they actually used Wisdom 726 to confirm doctrine at this important Toledo conference, and that is positive. So there we go. Which brings us up to our second segment. So if you're just tuning in, you don't know what in the world's going on, you need to watch the previous video or the one even before that to get an idea of what this series is all about. But anyway, we're moving through history, looking at these different opinions. So next on our list is Pope Martin I, dies 655. And as you can see here, he quotes the Deuterocanon positively. Um, in fact, he has a, therefore it is written. So he quotes it with a formal introduction. All of them are positive. So we can put Pope Martin I as positive. Number 4. Next, the Council of Constantinople III from 680 681. This, by the way, is an ecumenical council. And it uses the Deuterocanonical book just once, is the book of Baruch, chapter 3, in which it quotes it as coming from Jeremiah, which, by the way, in antiquity, this was quite normal, that Baruch was attached to Jeremiah, just like Lamentations and the Epistle of Jeremiah. So this is a single positive quote. And since it's identified with the proto-canonical book, we are going to put the Ecumenical Council of Constantinople III as a positive. So lots of positives. Okay, next is another council. This is one that's a little bit more dubious in terms of its status in the West. It is the Council of Trullo, also known as Quintisext, and it met at 692. Now, I'm just going to quote myself here because this is a decent summary of what's going on with the Trailing Council. We, by the way, have done a video here on the Apocrypha Apocalypse. So if you simply go to the search engine and type in Trullo, I'm sure you could find that video where we dig into it in depth. But there are lots of problems with this particular council, just FYI. Okay, so I quote myself saying, Trullo adopted the decrees of both of the councils of Carthage and Laodicea, including perhaps the spurious 60th canon as well. So in case you don't know, Laodicea is an early church council, and there is a 60th canon that gives the list of canonical books. It only includes Baruch and the Epistle, I believe, and it misses the book of Revelation in the New Testament. But I've done a video where we go into this particular council. There is no way the 60th canon is authentic. It was added later to the council. And so Trullo adopts it. We're not really clear whether Trullo's copy of Laodicea had the spurious 60th canon. So Maybe it did. Unless the Trillian Fathers rejected Laodicea's 60th canon or found some way to harmonize the incompatible list, which would have resulted, their position on Scripture remains hopelessly at odds with itself. In other words, Carthage affirmed the Deuterocanon, the spurious 60th canon of Laodicea didn't. So unless the Trillian Fathers were putting these two, they approved both of them and somehow harmonized the two, we don't know, right? Today, Orthodox, and I think we've talked to an Orthodox theologian on this, and he agrees. One way you can harmonize it is if you look at the two texts as not being exhaustive, but rather just descriptive. In other words, the books that are affirmed in Carthage and at Laodicea are all affirmed. So if it's missing from the Laodicean canon, that doesn't mean it's rejected. It's just silent on them. So it's basically the two are combined additively, not Laodicea restricting the canon, if that makes sense. Okay, so you could look at it that way, in which there wouldn't be any contradiction by adopting both of these particular councils. It could be that they didn't accept the 60th canon, in which case it could be very easily harmonized with Carthage. Um, or if they didn't harmonize it, then we have a contradiction. That make matters even more confusing. The Trillian Council also sanctioned the 85th decree of the so-called Apostolic Canons, which accepts the four books of Maccabees. The council also affirmed the teaching of several early church fathers on the subject, of whom at least two, Gregory Nazianzus and Amphiliochius, omit the Deuterocanon from their list. So again, it's kind of a hodgepodge, a different list. In fact, the 85th canon of the Apostolic Canons is part of a larger work called the Apostolic Constitutions, which is pseudepigraphic and problematic. It's certainly the New Testament that affirms is very problematic. So, what do we have at the Council of Trullo? It's really a mixture of incoherent list that perhaps you could harmonize all of these if you just say whatever is omitted by one source is affirmed by another, but it's kind of a hodgepodge of different um, canonical lists that may or may not be harmonized that way. So we are going to put the Trillian Council for the first time in our survey as a positive mixed. Now, this could go either way, but I think it probably leans towards favor. So I think that's probably the best way to designate it as positive mixed. And this is probably the lowest we've encountered so far. And we're almost to the 700s. Let's continue. We have another Council of Toledo, and this is Council 17 that met in 694. And we have a formal introduced quotation from Wisdom, and also Sirach is introduced as Solomon said. Now, remember back in our previous video when we were talking about, who was it? I don't think it was Isidore. Yeah, it was Isidore. We noted that for Jerome, he believed there were three books that constituted of Solomon, which is Proverbs, Song of Songs, Ecclesiastes. While in Carthage and also with Augustine, they would count as five books of Solomon, adding Sirach and Wisdom. And we noted that if someone counts Sirach as being among Solomon, then it clearly is not adopting Jerome's view because he would only accept three books, which would exclude Sirach. And it can't be a mistake because Sirach identifies that the author is not Solomon. So I think that's a good indication that Council of Toledo in 694 accepted the Deuterocanonical books. And so therefore we give it a positive. All right, we are cooking. Next on our list, this is found on everybody's list. It is Bede. Bede the historian. And this one's going to be interesting. So in his De uh, Temporum Rationale, excuse me, he writes, quote, thus far, divine scripture contains the series of events. The subsequent history of the Jews is exhibited in the book of Maccabees and in the writings of Josephus and Africanus, who continues the subsequent history down to the time of the Romans. Now, this is usually cited by Protestants as basically saying that canonical scripture ends before the book of Maccabees and excludes the book of Maccabees from the canon. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. I think Breen actually hits the nail on the head with this. Now, remember, Bede is a historian, so he's worried about chronicling history as a whole. Okay. So Breen's take is this, quote, he merely wishes to point out that it does not alone continue the series of historical events from Ezra to the era of the Romans. Up until the time of Ezra, indeed, not all historical events were written, but enough was written to form a continuous chain of chief events. And no other writings contain the events of those times except the holy books, which follow each other in a certain historical series. But after Ezra, a great lacuna occurs in the history of the Jews set down to the time of the Romans, which is only partly bridged over by the combined data of Maccabees, Africanus, and Josephus. The second book of Maccabees covers a period of only about 16 years, first of about 40, unquote. I think Breen hits the nail on the head. I think this is what Bede is saying. He's not saying that Maccabees is not part of the divine scripture. Rather, remember, he's a historian. And so he's looking at the Bible as history, much like Josephus, by the way. And what you find, if you look at the Bible as history, you have a long, continuous historical narrative. Again, like Breen points out, there are little gaps here and there, but it's enough to write a whole series of history up until a certain point. Josephus says around the time of Artaxerxes, or Bede says around the time of Ezra. After that point, then there is a break, and then suddenly the Maccabean period pops up in the Catholic Bible, and then it stops, and then in the first century, you don't have anything. But Josephus picks up the history from Maccabees, and he brings it all the way to the destruction of the temple, and Africanus too. So that's all he's pointing out, is that as far as scripture is concerned, the continuous narrative breaks down at the time of Ezra, or for Josephus, Artaxerxes. And by the way, we did a large series on Josephus, and check it out, folks, because that's basically what Josephus says. He's not making a canon. He's looking at it in terms of his historical narrative. And I think this is confirmed here in Bede. Let's go back to the first slide. He says, thus far, divine scripture contains what? The series of events. I read that as a continuous narrative, historical narrative. And then afterwards, then it's hodgepodge of things. Okay, so I think that answers that particular objection. Another time, and this is also appealed to, is he puts down the six wings of the four animals, which are 24, signify so many books of the Old Testament in which the authority of the evangelist is confirmed and their truth is corroborated. This is a commentary on Revelation chapter 4, of course. Breen says Bede has quoted all the Deuterocanonical books in solemn formulas customary to introducing divine scripture. In other words, if he restricted the Old Testament down to 24 books and restricted the books so that all those written after Ezra are not included in scripture, you can't explain how he uses the Deuterocanon as divine scripture, right? It's not affirmed in his other writings. In fact, quite the opposite. For example, here we have a formal quotation. It is written of Wisdom 4:7. By the way, this is also on Revelation, homily 16. And he also has another formally introduced quotation of Wisdom 2. And we'll read the last one. This is also on Revelation, the same work. It says, and he who talked with me had a measuring rod of gold, reaching from one end of the earth to the other mightily and ordering all things sweetly. So he's quoting Wisdom 8:1. Christ, who is the wisdom of God, measures the holy city. That is to say, Christ determines all things by way of number and measure and weight, and so distributes each one. And that is a quote from Wisdom 11:20, of the faithful the gifts of the spiritual graces. So here he actually applies wisdom and says that wisdom, when it's speaking of God disposing all things by number, weight, and measure, is actually Christ who does it. And he pins this with Revelation 21:15. Very interesting. Again, if it's just edifying literature, that doesn't make sense. He's using it as divine scripture. Again, on his work on Revelation, he introduced Wisdom 2 as it is written. Solomon says, and he quotes, I don't have the book here. I think this is also, I'm not sure. I think that's Wisdom. That's quoted as Solomon. But notice he also quotes the psalmist. No qualification or distinction between the two, which suggests that he held them on equal plane. And then finally in Revelation 6, that is under the testimony to the name of Christ, as it is said in Maccabees, and he quotes 2 Maccabees 7:36. So how do we qualify this? With Bede, I put it as positive, simply because he does talk about the 24 books, but he's using that as applying it to scripture. It doesn't seem like it gives any doctrinal weight to that. So the objections simply don't follow with what we see. And I think the first objection is a misunderstanding about Maccabees somehow being separate from the divine scripture. I don't even see that as a qualification. I don't see the books of Revelation as necessarily a qualification. The testimony, how he uses these books in Revelation is very clear. He's not really given this any doctrinal weight. I put it as a positive. But if you don't agree, I want to hear you in the chat room. Let me know why you don't agree with this. I think it could be a toss-up. You might want to put it as positive but qualified. I tend to look at it as positive, and therefore that's my rating, and that's how I see it. Next is Pope Gregory III, who died in 741. He cites formally deuterocanonical books, and surprise, surprise, he is positive. We'll do one more and then we'll finish up for today. The Council of Cliff, or Clovershoe, Abingdon, in 747. It gives one quotation from Sirach 34, and look, because according to the scripture, the almsgiving is from, and it continues. So a positive quotation from the book of Sirach formally introduces scripture. We have to give it a positive. Okay, we're going to end it right there. So guys, if you like this video, please subscribe. If you haven't, give a thumbs up, ring a bell, tell your friends. We're going on the worm's eye view, going father by father in the Middle Ages. So hopefully you're enjoying this. And by the way, if you want to show off to everybody that you view this video till the very end, I want you to go in the comment section, type in, I watched till the end. Okay, let everybody know that you are a diehard deuterocanonical scholar. All right. Hope everybody has a great week. Bye-bye.